Here.
Commissioner Cogill. Commissioner Severson. Commissioner Vita.
Here.
Commissioner Forney. President Bourne.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Secretary Ringgold. I would entertain a motion for the approval of the agenda with the following additions: that resolutions 2018-244 and 2018-246 will be coming forward this evening from the Admin and Finance Committee. Is there a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on approval of the agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, abstentions, the motion carries. Is there a motion for the approval of the minutes of our minutes online? There are no minutes this evening. Thank you. Then we will move into reports of officers. Superintendent Merrill.
Thank you. Thank you, President Bourne. We do have a few items here just to update you, and then we're going to have Joelle Allen come and update us on the superintendent search. But as you probably are aware, Weber opened again, and staff, correct me if I'm wrong, it's still open, right? Okay. Yeah, so we're working on lots of options to try to keep it working for everyone, for all the people in the community. So please, we thank you for your indulgence. More than 500 Minneapolis Public School fourth graders enrolled in summer school and are visiting Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden for a full day of nature immersion and study this summer. Participants are learning about bird and plant adaptations through a variety of engaging activities with the Wildflower Garden staff. So we're excited that the school board through the summer school is taking full advantage of the historic Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden. The Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association and the Minnesota chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects are hosting their annual Summer Landscape Design Tour on August 8th, if anybody's interested. The tour will highlight 6 locations, including the award-winning Wetland Boardwalk at Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden and Bird Sanctuary. That's the place to be this summer. And the newly recreated Halls Island. Reservations are being taken through August 6th on the MNLA website. So please try to get into that. It looks like it's going to be pretty exciting. The Pollinators Party, a celebration of bees, was held on Thursday, July 26th at the Lindell Park Gardens. More than 400 attendees came out to learn about wild bees, honeybees, and habitat, make some art, dance with bee love, and enjoy the music and eat honey ice cream. So this year's herd of Gert are happily munching away at the invasive species at Thitterworth Park. Last week, the goats moved along from the south end of the park to the far northwest portion of the park near Twin Lake and Worth Golf Course. The goats are being supervised by the contractor 24 hours a day, so don't worry, and may be on site for another week in Worth. A lot is happening, getting ready for fall sports. The park board has introduced a new flag football program option for 6U and 8U age groups, and you can check out your local rec center if you want to get involved in that. There are coaches meetings occurring, both from the standpoint of getting ready for the fall for our youth programs and then also for our adult programs. Safety Camp enjoyed over 130 swimmers who participated in the Water Day hosted by Aquatics and Recreation. Campers took part in a mini swim lesson, gigantic land, blow-up water obstacle course, and water safety classes. And we all know that Safety Camp is a wonderful opportunity for our young people to get introduced to our firefighters and our police officers on a very close and personal way. They attend the camp with them. They are in plain clothes, and then it's only when the last day when they're having their dinner with families that the officers in return, who have been their camp leaders all week long, in their uniforms. And so it's amazing the how the children react and the relationships that are built through the safety camp summer. So with that, I'm going to ask Joel Allen to come forward from KP Companies to update us on the superintendent search. Welcome.
Good evening, Commissioners, Superintendent. Things are well underway in terms of the search. We opened the applications on July 12th. We are starting to get quite a few applications in, which is really encouraging. Our firm has already started some initial screenings as it relates to just general qualifications. We are also starting some of the search activities, but really wanting to make sure that we go into the listening process and complete that process prior to really making some decisions. We have created another 15 listening sessions that range everything from employee sessions to the business community to specific cultural groups, and those are going throughout the month of August. And as a result, we've extended the application deadline for the superintendent search to match the listening sessions, which will now be August 31st. Those changes have already been made to the website, and we've made them where we can in print and publications, and then certainly as the news cycles come out for our other publications, those will be updated as well. That really kind of concludes the report. Are there any questions?
Do commissioners have questions for Ms. Allen? I see Commissioner Musich, followed by Commissioner Forney.
Thank you, President Bourne. What sort of turnout are we having at the sessions that have been held thus far?
The sessions have not had great turnout, to tell you the honest truth. And so we have reached out not only to our community outreach department to make sure that we can get more people in the room, but also I appeal to you all as commissioners to please help spread the word in your different districts so that we can get good attendance.
Is there an intention to have some sort of meet and greet type situation for candidates that are finalists for this position for the public?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And dates haven't been set on that yet, but similar to what we've done in other high-level searches, we'll do that same kind of meet and greet with the top 3 candidates, make sure employees are comfortable with them, certainly kind of take a look at those interactions, and then reconvene after that.
Okay, lovely. And how would I find out who all is appointed to the superintendent search committee? Because I'm not really finding that anywhere.
We are still in that process, so I can make sure that I send a report to commissioners so that you guys know exactly what that is.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
I will.
Thank you, Commissioner Musich. Commissioner Forney.
Thank you, Joelle, for the update. So if we're extending the deadline, what was the deadline, first of all, before?
It was August 12th. So initially we had a 30-day application process, and now it's, not quite twice that, but almost.
Okay, and my only concern is that now it's pushing the other end too. So are we changing up those dates as well?
At this point, it's too early to tell. I don't think we're going to have to push out most of those dates because some of this stuff can be done in tandem, right? So if you look at applications, for example, who come in and who are not qualified, those are things that we can kind of take care of right away, right? We know that they don't meet, 80 or 90% of the criteria. Those are things that we can start to address immediately. What we are waiting on in terms of completing the listening sessions are for those candidates who really have experience that we need to take a look at. And we want to make sure we get all voices in before making those decisions. So a lot of it's in tandem. At this point, we're not pushing out other dates.
Okay, I do have a concern about that, but I appreciate you broadening the listening as much as possible, but they both have urgency.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Commissioner Forney. Are there any other questions for Ms. Allen? Thank you. And then just a reminder for folks that might be watching and might be interested in the upcoming listening sessions. Can you remind folks of the website?
Absolutely. The website is mprbsupersearch.com. Again, mprbsupersearch.com. You can find out about the listening sessions. You can apply for the position and then get updates in terms of news as well.
And if folks aren't available to attend one of those numerous listening sessions, but they still want to give input, is there an opportunity to do that on the
Online.
website? Okay, fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the update, Ms. Allen.
Thank you.
Superintendent Merrill, is that the conclusion of your report? Thank you. We would move on to reports of standing committees. Chair Cogill from the Admin and Finance Committee.
On behalf of the Admin and Finance Committee, I'd like to move Resolution 2018-227, resolution approving an agreement with the River West Condominium Association located at 401 First Street South, Minneapolis, to allow the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board to capture rainwater for reuse in the Waterworks project.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on 2018-227? Seeing none, all those in favor of Resolution 2018-227, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions, the motion carries. Chair Meyer.
On behalf of the Legislative and Intergovernmental Committee, I'll move 2018-238, a resolution supporting both questions of the Minneapolis Public School referendum that will be posed to voters in 2018.
Thank you. The motion has been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on Resolution 2018-238? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The
Abstention.
motion carries with one abstention. Moving on to unfinished business, I would entertain a motion for Resolution 2018-239, consenting to the assignment and assumption agreement for 27 Maple Place, Minneapolis, located on Nicollet Island within the Central Mississippi Riverfront Regional Park. Is there a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on 2018-239? Seeing none, all of those in favor of Resolution 2018-239. Council Rice, does this require?
Yes.
This does require a roll call. All those, if the secretary, I'm calling the vote, if the secretary would please take the roll on 2018-239.
Commissioner Musich.
Aye.
Commissioner Cogill.
Aye.
Commissioner Severson. Aye. Commissioner Meyer.
Aye.
Commissioner Vita.
Aye.
Commissioner Forney.
Aye.
President Bourne.
Aye.
You have 7 ayes, 2 absent. You have a majority vote.
Fantastic. The
Sorry.
motion carries. You're just fine. Moving on to new business, we have two items from Adam Arvidsson. If we'll start with our capital improvement program and our equity metrics for undeveloped parks. Mr. Arvidsson.
Thank you, President Bourne, Commissioners. So we are beginning the budget process for the year, as you all well know. I was able to stand in front of you and talk a little bit at the budget retreats about how the CIP process works, the capital improvement program process works. And what I'd like to do tonight is discuss a couple of different items related to that as we begin to craft that 6-year CIP. Tonight I want to just sort of do a recap about the CIP process and its format. I want to talk about the funding sources, basically what money is going to be available to us for capital improvements. I have some notes and some general recommendations from staff on the CIP, and then I want to reveal the new equity metrics and rankings for 2018. So those will be passed out to you in a few moments. Then obviously we'll have an opportunity to discuss those metrics and have any questions. And then lastly, perhaps the more lengthy portion of this is to have a conversation about the sort of third leg, I guess, if you will, of our metrics stool. We do have metrics for our neighborhood parks that are built. We have metrics for our regional parks. We do not have metrics for those undeveloped parks in our system, but we think it might be important to do so. So I want to raise some ideas before the board tonight on that topic. So we have a 6-year capital improvement program here at the Park Board. The reason we do that is to make sure that we have an extra year on the end so that we can integrate with the city's own capital long-range improvement committee process, which starts much earlier than we do. So the 6th year gives guidance for when I'm doing those submittals next year. The guidance for the capital improvement program itself really comes from the comprehensive plan. It comes from our criteria-based system for project scheduling, which is also known as the equity metric, the strategic directions that you've set forward, and then also the regional park and neighborhood park master plans that are currently underway. This year's CIP is going to look similar to last year's. I think many of you have seen it. It does have color coding to really talk about how does a project come into the CIP, whether it was sort of there before our equity metrics or whether it's coming in as a result of the equity metrics. And again, with every year we have less yellow and more blue as we phase out the old way of doing the CIP and bring in the new. We always do show changes in separate columns. So essentially, the CIP includes an active redlining. So we'll show you what was there last year that was adopted and then what we propose for this year. Some cases it's the same, but when it's not, then you can see those differences. And we do have separate sections of the CIP for the neighborhood and the regional other projects and then the rehabilitation program. Schedule-wise, sorry, that says 2017, but actually in 2018, a staff work group and myself have been convening to update the neighborhood metrics and to develop the undeveloped park and trail metrics. August 1st, which is tonight, we'll have an initial discussion about the CIP and those metrics. During September, primarily, is when I actually prepare the big old spreadsheet that gets included with the superintendent's budget. Should the board think that it's appropriate to consider some kind of ordinance modification or a new ordinance for undeveloped parks, there are 3 meetings where that could come forward for final consideration for the board. The 2 meetings in September and then the meeting in October, so that when the budget is presented on October 17, it would be taking into account that brand new ordinance. So this spreadsheet on the screen right now shows where funding sources currently lie. I'm going to actually skip down and talk about the neighborhood sources first because they are more straightforward. The NPP 20 brings $10.5 million per year. In the most out year of this chart is when there is a possible increase based on sort of real-world inflationary considerations. We don't know what that will be or if that will be, so I've just kept the numbers stable. We also put $2.18 million of our neighborhood capital levy into capital projects. The park dedication is really kind of to be determined. As we craft the CIP, I'm always looking for park dedication that's coming in and trying to allocate those to projects based on neighborhood guidance and based on what other projects we have going on in the CIP. Minnesota State bonding, I have to verify exactly what year this is happening, but we will get about a $6 million match as a portion of the Upper Harbor Terminal collaboration that we got with the city of Minneapolis. So that's a direct bonding appropriation that will come in. It actually sits in the regional parks, but so it's there at any rate. I want to talk about the regional parks, which is the top half of the chart a little bit. You'll notice in that very first column on the left, I have a weird or in the funding, which really screws up my spreadsheets, I have to say, to have an or in there. But essentially what has happened is, if you all remember from our legislative session last year, the state did bond at a $10 million level, which is great. That's excellent for the regional parks. They did so not with general obligation bonds, but instead with Environmental Natural Resources Trust Fund bonds. The Met Council still has not determined whether they can or will match those bonds with Met Council bonds, as they normally do. If they do match those bonds, our share will be $3.4 million of that $10 million, of that $10 million plus the match. If they do not match the bonds, it will be $2 million. So you can see there's a significant difference for us if the Met Council chooses not or is unable to match those bonds. So that's kind of an odd number there that I have to carry through at this moment because that determination has not been made. We hope that that's coming soon. Parks and Trails Legacy, the 2019 money we knew about. In 2020 and 2021, the number is actually quite a fair bit higher than it has been in the past. It's approximately $1 million more per each of those years than we have estimated in the past. That is primarily the result of two things. The economy is really good, so sales tax receipts are good, and that's what funds this program. And secondly, the regional park visitor counts have just come in for the year, and we've seen significant increases in our visitorship as a system. Just by way of example, the chain of lakes went from 5 million visits up to 7 million visits over the course of that year. That is a 4-year average that's taken, so we're not even just talking about it's a single year trend. It's actually a trend line that is exhibiting significant increase in use of our park system in particular compared to other regional park systems. So that's a double-edged sword, right? It means we get more funds to support these parks, but it also means there are more people in the parks who are enjoying them, which is wonderful, but the wear and tear is there. So just wanted to highlight that those Parks and Trails allocations for us have now topped $4 million for those next 2 years. As a result of that, and these changes in shares, for the 2022, 23, and 24, normally we estimate the Parks and Trails dollars at about $3.25 million a year, and then we adjust that upward when the final numbers come in. We haven't been at 3.25 for some time. It's always been higher. So I'm actually adjusting our estimates upward to 3.75 and would propose building a CIP based on that number so that I can be more accurate. When there's a large gap between what we proposed in the CIP and then what I'm asked to submit, I'm sort of going without a policy parachute, and I'd love to be closer to that when we present the CIP to you in the fall. So that's why those numbers have gone up a little bit. The lottery in lieu, which is ostensibly for major capital rehabilitation and not for new projects, remains pretty stable, stable at that $1.3 million. A few notes on the CIP and how we as staff tend to craft the CIP, obviously barring additional guidance from you. We feel that projects that are already in the CIP shouldn't be altered, if at all possible. We really try to keep that promise to the community, regardless of where that park's equity score sends them. So sometimes there's fluctuation in the equity scores. If a park drops down a little bit lower, we don't eliminate that park simply because its score dropped down. We keep it in the CIP. It's difficult, it would be difficult otherwise for community members and for our own planners to get ahead of like these projects that are coming down the pike. Typically, we place the new parks that come into the, that get their scores to the level where they can come into the CIP. We put those projects at the outmost year. Otherwise, if we put them in inner years, we would delay projects that are already in the CIP. So essentially, we're always trying to build that outmost year. So in this case, we'll be building the 2024. We'll incorporate a certain number of parks into that 2024 year based on their equity metric, which I will pass around in just a moment. And then lastly, we've sort of made the determination here that parks don't get additional allocations even if they keep their high equity scores until all the parks receive funding. So the ordinance does say that MTB 20 should be distributed on a rolling basis. So our intent is to work through all the parks and then come back around to the top parks again, rather than continuing to invest in some of the same parks over and over again. So this is a really prioritization effort that gets to the parks with the greatest need first. So under our ordinance, MPRB staff, we have convened a staff group to reevaluate the overall neighborhood equity metrics. So we take a look, this is true for regional too, we take a look at each one and we sort of think to ourselves, have there been unintended consequences? Are there things that we need to change? Do we need to look at this or propose to you ways of changing the ordinance to make that more equitable or to ensure that the equity goals are being upheld? We also do update the underlying data every year. And then during the development of that next CIP, so during the development of that 2019-2024 CIP, which is starting really now, those rankings are locked in. So we don't sort of change from week to week or month to month. Otherwise, we'd never be able to build a CIP around that. So there comes a time where we lock in those rankings, and then another reevaluation occurs in the summer of 2019. So in a few moments, we're going to pass around those equity rankings to you and to the audience here, and they will be available online, probably starting tomorrow. We consider those to be the draft equity rankings. We believe that they are exactly correct, but if we do see any errors in them, we'll be correcting them in the short term. And then at that time, we'll be essentially kind of locking in those numbers. So if a park has a rank of number 37, it will stay number 37 for the duration of this cycle, and then that will be reevaluated again in the next year. In terms of the evaluation itself, and this is actually going to probably work out from a timing standpoint perfectly, because I'm going to get through a couple of slides, and then I'm going to not pass out the equity metrics until after open time, which is lovely, because we don't want you to be distracted with the goodies I'm going to give you. Staff has found again that the metrics do work well, and we don't believe that there should be any substantive changes to the ordinance, nor to how the metrics are calculated. You will see that few parks, very few parks, moved significantly up or down in ranking. Last year, from last year to the previous, there were actually quite a few major moves. And this year there are fewer of those. And the primary reason is that the RCAPs, or the racially concentrated areas of poverty, changed less between last year and this year than they did in the preceding 2 years. So that drives significantly where our park rankings sit, and so there's a little less change that's happening. I do want to highlight one error that we discovered. These are very complicated spreadsheets, and so every once in a while, as we're tweaking things through, we find glitches in them. We found one error that was in place last year. Under the longevity weight, and you will see this, under the longevity weight, there was a transposition of assets that should be scored 0 versus assets that should be scored 1. Now, there are many assets that are averaged within a park. So it's average upon average, and so that's a fairly non-substantial error. Correcting this didn't create significant ranking changes, but we did correct it this year. And so on the spreadsheet, you will see quite a lot of color where we show changes up or down in that particular metric. And the reason why is because of that transposition of that one point. The next thing I was going to do was hand out the things. So President Bourne, I think if you want to, if I can pause now, it might be a good moment too, if that's all right with you.
That's just fine, Mr. Arvidsson. The open time will start in just about 2 minutes. We have 9 speakers signed up for open time. I'll just kind of go over a guideline of what our requests and expectations are during open time. We do our community comments section at 5:30 at every one of our meetings, and it's an opportunity for the Minneapolis Park Board of Commissioners to hear from community members on any topic. We don't, the Park Board of Commissioners does not debate with folks that are coming forward to give testimony, but we're here to listen. We just have a couple, so thank you for folks that have come out tonight. Any individuals that do wish to speak can do so by calling in before 3 o'clock and get put on our speakers list. Our open time on our agenda does not exceed 15 minutes with the time to be allocated by the president. I will give everybody, I think 90 seconds comes pretty close to our 15-minute time. During open time, public testimony is given without debate. Again, the commissioners may ask a clarifying question, but we don't judge the comments that you're giving. If anybody has signs or anything that they'd like to display, we just kind of ask that you be thoughtful to folks that may be sitting behind you, and that if you have signs that you want to display, that you just kind of be on the perimeter of the room. We ask that folks remain seated during open time unless they're asked to come forward to speak. There's only 2 types of comments that we don't hear at our open time, and those are pending litigation issues and personnel issues. So if you're here and you have comments or concerns around either of those, your best way to bring those forward is to commissioners directly. So we just want to be sensitive to the items that we do have to keep confidential. The Park Board doesn't tolerate discriminatory and/or harassing words directed at anyone, so please keep that in mind when you are making your comments. That gets me to 5:30 on the dot by the time Ms. Freed makes it to the microphone. So my first speaker is Ms. Freed, followed by Constance Pepin. Arlene, if you would state your name and if you're comfortable, your address for the record.
Arlene Freed, 1109 Xerxes Avenue South. And I'm going to start off by saying many of you know me associated with Park Watch. However, back in 1987, I was a board member of ELECT, the group that in 1987 led the effort to pass the shoreline height ordinance. It was an effort that spanned 2 years and cost, many people do not know this, but it cost the city over $200,000 for reimbursement of the citizens' legal fees. There was litigation. Commissioners, preserving our natural resources. In 1987, when developers proposed a 24-story apartment building adjacent to the Calhoun Beach Club and across the street from Lake Calhoun, concerned citizens throughout the city let their council members know how vital our lakes were to the unique identity of Minneapolis. In response, the City Council unanimously voted in 1988 to adopt the Shoreline Height Ordinance, conforming to, at the time, DNR protections, limiting building height within 1,000 feet of lakes. Barbara Carlson, who was the 7th Ward Council member at the time, was the council member who led the effort. As I understand it, under Minneapolis 2040, those protections would be weakened. We advocated for height limitations around the lakes so that trees, birds, and nature would be the predominating features, not tall glass and cement structures. The only
Ms. Freed, if you could just finish up your sentence in the next 10 or 15 seconds, that would be great.
Well, I'd really like to complete my, I know within 3 minutes, ordinance was passed to have been along Lake Street, which is a commercial corridor. Those of us who successfully advocated for the shoreline height ordinance would advise against any significant revision of the shoreline or overlay district. The only way to protect the lakes from inappropriate development is to establish and maintain clear guidelines so developers know the rules early on. The lakes and parkways are our parks and should be preserved and protected for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Freed. My next speaker is Constance Pepin. Connie, if you would say your name and if you're comfortable, your address for the record.
Constance Pepin, thanks. I'm going to talk really fast because a minute and a half goes so fast. First thing I want to say is I would like to ask specifically that you remove the paragraph about the shoreline overlay in the letter that you're going to consider tonight. It's not needed, it won't help, and it will do harm to leave that in. One thing that's kind of crazy about the last sentence in the first paragraph under land use is that it's already been, the city's already exceeding the fact that the city is exceeding the ordinance suggests it's planned obsolescence. The city can't just get rid of the shoreline overlay because it's state mandated. You know, you have to follow the state pollution or environmental rules. But as I mentioned, it would really harm the lakes if you start changing the shoreline overlay. And it's not draconian. That was mentioned in an email I got. It's just not true. You don't change a law because the city's breaking it, because people are breaking it. And I'm really troubled by the idea that the city is willing to change this just because of the city's, the parkway would change this because of the city's density goals. That's not your job. Your mission is to permanently preserve, protect, maintain, improve, and enhance the natural resources, parkland, and recreational opportunities for current and future generations. It's not to help the city reach density goals. It's not to sacrifice our natural resources for the current leadership's ideological priorities. And I really ask that if you're going to do anything like this, you don't do it today and you instead establish a task force or some kind of group. This doesn't need to be in the letter. So please get public input about this before you take any action, and do not have it in the letter that you're going to send for the 2040 plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pepin. My next speaker I have listed is Mary Patok, and then followed by Kathy Law, I believe. Mary, if you would state your name and if you're comfortable, your address for the public record.
My name is Mary Patok. I represent the Cedar Isles Dean Neighborhood Association. I'm here to speak to that same section of the board's proposed letter to the city regarding the comprehensive plan, specifically the sentence, movement towards performance-based criteria rather than predetermined height and setback rules. CIDNA vigorously opposes this language because it would weaken the protections for our precious lakes and creeks and river that we all fought so hard to pass a number of years ago. The beauty of height and setback rules is that they are clear. They mean what they mean and nothing else. By contrast, performance-based criteria are indeterminate concepts that can be debated and subverted by politics. Perhaps there are rules for both objective and subjective criteria. Some people have assured us that we are misinterpreting this proposed language and that it would strengthen the shoreland overlay ordinance. If so, then the language needs clarification because then a number of us are misinterpreting it. No one in this room is naive. We all know developers are hovering like birds of prey over Minneapolis shoreline property, eager to monopolize and monetize it for the benefit of the few and the expense of the many. This is a powerful political and economic threat we rely on you to resist. We urge you to solicit additional public opinion and to vigorously fulfill the Park Board mission of preserving and protecting our natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is Kathy Law, followed by Abby Rubin, followed by Dan Brady. Is Kathy, if you would say your name and if you're comfortable, your address for the public record.
Catherine Lowe, and I'm also commenting on your proposed 2040 comment letter. Performance-based criteria sounds too subjective and needs clarification. Consideration of a project's overall visual and environmental impact with benefits for developments that improve water quality and environmental performance. I ask what kind of benefits and for whom? To involve partner agencies such as the MPRB sounds too weak. You should be more than involved. And recommending changes to the Shoreline Overlay District without public input is a bad idea. MPRB has come so far in soliciting and considering public input from the community. It would be a betrayal to support this kind of a change to the Shoreline Overlay District without soliciting public input. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. My next speaker I have is Abby Rubin. Is Abby here this evening? Abby, if you would come forward and state your name and if you're comfortable, your address for the public record. My next speaker after Abby is Dan Brady. Hello, Abby.
Timer after I introduce myself. Abby Rubin, Ewing Avenue, Minneapolis. Hello. To my own surprise, I've been a lifelong resident of Minnesota. I grew up near Minnehaha Creek in Edina and biked over to Harriet, Bidé-Makaska, and Isles almost every summer day since age 10. I then moved uptown at age 18 to be even closer to the chain of lakes. And since 1996, I've been lucky enough to live a block and a half south of Cedar Lake. And I say to my surprise, I'm still here because I hate winter. And I'm in the advertising and production business, so that would have logically called me to either coast. But instead now I host colleagues in that business and friends from New York and LA who are absolutely in awe and gobsmacked about what we have here. They can't believe the green spaces we have right here in the city, which I call our Emerald City. Yes, we have great theater, music, schools, and restaurants, but so do a lot of other cities. What makes us enviable is our green space and our water. Without clean water, open vistas, and green space, we have nothing. Nothing special. Not to be dramatic, but the earth is literally on fire all around us. To destroy the very qualities that put us in the catbird seat would be naive and short-sighted. In light of the board's mission statement, we count on you to continue to champion and protect the city, the state, the planet, and therefore us. Please protect the SOD and strengthen it. The shoreline currently in place when enforced is working. It's hardly draconian. Thank you for all that you do and will continue to do for us.
Thank you, Abby. My next speaker that I have signed up is Dan Brady, followed by, I think, Jan Prescott, if I'm reading it right. Dan, if you would state your name and if you're comfortable, your address for the record.
Dan Brady, 624th Street Northeast, Donald neighborhood. At 4 o'clock today, I got an email saying that this was happening, and I was just floored. Over a year and a half ago, DNR asked us, or asked the citizens of the city to provide comments on a critical area plan for the Mississippi River. And I provided comments through the Great River Coalition. And here it is today, the noise coming from CPAD is asking you guys to look somewhere else regarding the shoreline heights and development issues. We have to take a stand. The park board has got to take a stand. The citizens of this community need to take a stand. I just don't get why they think when they go to cocktail parties with the developers, they believe that they should rewrite what we have been looking at in development along the river for the last 18 years. I mean, I'm happy with what you guys are doing. I think, incrementally you're buying lots to provide accessibility for the river community to the river. I just don't understand why they think they can trump us. So I plead with you guys to put up a wall on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. The next speaker I have is Jan Prescott, followed by Mary, I think, Harborough. Is Jan here this evening? You can help me when you get up to the microphone, but thank you. Jan, if you could state your name and, if you're comfortable, your address for the record.
My name is Jan Prescott, and I've lived many, many years in this neighborhood at 2308 Lake Place. Okay. I came tonight, I was one of the people involved with ELECT when the shoreline ordinance was passed. And then it took a lot of effort, a lot of volunteer effort, raising money, and we raised $200,000, and it took a lot of work to do that. And then life goes on, and then, whoop, it comes up again. I think it really should not be changed at all. So the developers understand what the line is, because we've seen that before. Any way that they can get more land to build on around the lakes, they'll make that effort because it's profit. But for those of us who live around here, who live in the Minneapolis area, and it's just not the people that live around there, it's everybody who uses it, and that's probably a lot of suburbanites too. We want to maintain the beauty of the area and the life, the animals and the environment. We don't want more high-rise buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Mary, I'm going to let you correct me on your last name when you come up to the mic. But Mary, if you would state your name and, if you're comfortable, your address for the record.
Yes, I am Mary Harlow, Harlow. And I was a founding member of ELECT, the Emergency Lakes Environmental Task Coalition that was formed 30 years ago and led the effort to pass the Shoreline Height Ordinance. It was an effort that spanned 2 years, and as Arlene stated, cost the city over $200,000 for reimbursement of the citizens' legal fees. We're really here to ask, what is the point of a park that is not accessible and not enjoyable? The Shoreland Overlay Ordinance was granted to the people of Minneapolis by the courts to protect the lakes and parkways, where over 7 million people from all over the suburbs, visitors, and residents of Minneapolis come to relax, to recreate, to enjoy the beauty of nature and of our parks and our beautiful lakes. We're here to ask you to stand as defenders of our parks and lakes, to protect to protect the heritage of the city of Minneapolis. Once it is gone, it cannot be reclaimed. It is the gem of Minneapolis, and it belongs to us all. Please do not let developers monetize it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. The final speaker I have signed up is Clara Beck, if I'm reading that right. Claire, if you would come forward, and if I need to get a correct pronunciation of your name, you'll help me with there. State your name and address for the record, if you're comfortable.
Thank you. I'm Clara Beck. I live in Minneapolis, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. Many of the comments that have been said tonight are reflected in my own prepared comments, so I'm going to try to hit some highlights on some things that were not mentioned. But I do want to underscore that my request of all of you is that you will defend the shoreline overlay district as it exists. As you look at the lakes, there is open space, so it's proof that it's working. And specifically, I think the height ordinance element is a powerful tool that we must not erode or diminish. Part of why this is coming up, of course, is because of the Minneapolis 2040 plan, and we know that there's increased density anticipated for the area, 500 to 600,000 residents. According to Heather Worthington, who's the Director of Long Range Planning, we already have the capacity under existing zoning, without changing any of the ordinances, for 2 million housing units. And so, to me, I wonder why there's pressure to modify something that's protecting a special asset, such as our parkland, in the name of density, when we already have capacity for those 2 million housing units. I think it's an important question to ask. Some of the park board commissioners play roles in other committees in the city, on the City Planning Commission, and I think that's where we need to start to leverage and gain some strength about exercising and observing the shoreline overlay ordinance rather than issuing variances and CUPs. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Claire. Claire's my final speaker. Is there anybody who signed up on the list whose name I did not call? All right, then with that said, I will close open time. Just for the folks that are here, you probably are aware of this, but we have a conversation scheduled in probably about 15 minutes. As soon as we're done with the capital project, we'll be talking about this. So if folks want to stick around for that and hear our comments and thoughts on it as well. So I will go back to Adam Arvidsson.
And Secretary Ringgold can hand out the goodies now. Thank you, President, Board and Commissioners. I guess what I want to do while those are being passed out is I'm going to bring up on the large screen here the neighborhood equity metric sheet, simply so that I can help navigate how it's how to read it. So I'm going to zoom in a bit here so that people in the audience can also sort of follow along with how this is read. So I'm going to go very quickly from left to right. There's a whole lot of columns. I know there's a lot of information here. The most important columns is the one that says park name, and you'll see I've got a lot of blue there near the top of the screen. The blue highlighted parks mean those that are already in the CIP and were brought into the CIP under the equity metric already. As you scroll down through this list, you will notice that there are white parks just below that grouping. So presumably these would be the parks that would be next in line for entry into the CIP. The rank for 2018 is in the second column in the greenish color, and we are showing for reference last year's rank. And then in the far left column, it's change. We do show the total score, last year's total score, the neighborhood, and then scrolling to the right are the 7 different neighborhood equity metrics that we have. So the columns that are not shaded show basically our underlying data, like what is the threshold. But the scoring, which adds up to the total, are in the blue columns. So this score is right here is for parks that are getting a score under either the RCAP rule or the ACP 50 rule. and always next to there's a gray column for last year's number. I've highlighted those parks in green, which have seen an increase in their point total, and in orange, where they've seen a decrease in their point total. Here's the density weight number, the youth weight, the safety weight. Those are the community characteristics. And as we go further to the right, we see the park characteristics, which are the condition, the longevity, and the historic investment. Now you'll note in that longevity column, that is the rectification of that error that I mentioned before. So you'll see parks that are moving up or down quite a bit, and that's because perhaps one of their assets was misscored last year. The changes are relatively minor because, again, we're averaging a lot of assets. So if one asset had the wrong score out of 7, you're getting a very small percentage point change. Just by way of example, this one right here went from 1.5 to 1.2, so it's a 0.3 loss out of 23 total points. So that is how the neighborhood metrics are scored. And then in the regional metrics, which is the other sheet that has many fewer parks on it, I'm going to bring those up on screen too for everyone. Let me zoom in here. This one's organized a little bit differently because we have fewer parks, but we have more metrics. So similarly, we have the list of parks here. The 2 regional opportunity facilities, which are not ranked because they are essentially undeveloped regional parks and get dedicated funding every year, are at the top. And then the rankings begin after that. Again, the blue ones are the 4 that were brought in last year under these equity metrics. You see they remain this year the top 4. And then we have parks descending down below that. Our metrics for the regional system are the RCAP, people's ability to access those parks by different modes, and then the safety. And on the second page of this sheet, we have the same parks, and then the park characteristics, which is the historic investment, the use intensity, all of which have been updated for this year's new numbers, the ADA compliance, natural resources, and trail quality. There's been very little change in the regional parks from one year to the next, which we might expect. They cover a larger area, so they're less permeable to demographic changes because we are averaging many neighborhoods that touch those neighborhood parks. So that's how those are read. I just wanted to show a really quick map here with a comparison of the RCAPs from last year or this year. RCAPs, as you may know, that stands for Racially Concentrated Area of Poverty. There is some discussion around what exactly the nomenclature of that should be. Our ordinance says RCAP. There's also some terms of art that use the words ACP 50, which stands for an area of concentrated poverty where more than 50% of the population are people of color. So I've kind of highlighted those both. It's the same thing. It's a different language. The ACP is an area of concentrated poverty, and then the POC 50 are those neighborhoods where the majority of people are people of color. So you can see those 3. The primary changes that you're seeing between 2007 and 2008, and they're relatively minor in the RCAPs, not like between 2006 and 2016 and 2017, where the RCAPs actually increased fairly significantly. Here there's a couple places where they've actually shrunk a little bit, namely over in the Corcoran neighborhood, where I'm highlighting here. Also in the Homewood, is that right? Homewood neighborhood by Farwell Park. And then there's some change a little bit up by the Shingle Creek. And then there's a elimination of a major ACP area in northeast Minneapolis, which has come above that, that poverty threshold. And also the far southern part of the city around Dawson Field. For some years that had been an area of concentrated poverty, and it no longer shows as such. So that's kind of what the RCAPs look like. I'm going to get in a moment to an opportunity for questions about the metrics and the CIP before I move into the undeveloped parks ordinance. I just have one more slide, which is that as we are doing our evaluations of the ordinance this year, the neighborhood ordinance specifically, we actually would recommend one relatively minor change to the ordinance. And so I want to describe that to you and then get your thoughts on it. This is under the neighborhood density metric. Currently, the ordinance uses actual numbers as thresholds for scoring. So if a neighborhood has a certain number of population, 10,000 say, then it gets a certain point total. As the city becomes more dense, more and more neighborhoods will fall into the denser category. And the same would be true if the city becomes less dense. More and more neighborhoods would fall into the less dense category. That means differentiation between the neighborhoods will become minimal. And part of our purpose here is to prioritize parks one against the other based on neighborhood characteristics. So if they're all starting to fall into the same category, we're not doing that. So what we're suggesting is actually changing the language to set those thresholds as percentages of overall city density rather than as hard numbers. This will allow us to still have 3 scoring tiers that self-adjust as the city changes, so that we can continue to have those 3 different tiers. So a couple of issues, metrics, issues and questions on the CIP and the metrics. I realized as I was submitting the click report this year that I deleted a line from last year's CIP, unfortunately. Elliott Park, which had been previously funded to the tune of $1.5 million in 2022, was simply deleted from the spreadsheet at some point as I was going through different versions. I noticed this error as I was submitting the click report, as I said. I think it's important to restore that back in its regular year and funding level into the next round of the CIP and not put it at the end. We should put it back in 2022. This will have an effect on some other projects, but in theory, those projects actually shouldn't have been as early as they were anyways, had that error not been made. So I just want to alert everyone to that. A big question on the CIP, number 1, is do you feel staff should bring forward an ordinance revision of the density metric as I described? And then also I'd like to now take the opportunity for any other questions about the metrics or the CIP or any other discussion items that you'd like to have about this particular topic before I move into the undeveloped parks ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. Arvidsson. We'll open it up for discussion. I think I have Commissioner Musich.
Thank you, President Bourne. So the regional park number, is that updated annually based on an average of the past 4 years, or is it something that's done just on a periodic basis?
President Bourne, Commissioner Musich, the regional park visitor counts are updated annually, and then that count, so like the 2017 count that was just released, is an average of the preceding 4 years. So there's a rolling average, but there is a new count that has come out. It comes out every year.
Okay. Would it be possible for district commissioners to receive those counts for their district, for the regional parks that fall within our boundaries?
Yes, President Bourne, Commissioner Musich, there is a report on the Met Council website, and I can certainly forward that link around to the commissioners so you're aware of it. So that's all publicly available online now.
That would be helpful. Thank you. The other question I had about the rankings, I guess kind of relates to the unranked number that you're going to be talking about with us next. But the numbers we've been working with for a number of years has not included undeveloped parks. Many of those parks, people have been waiting a long time, like the one in my district, over 14 years now. People have been waiting for us to do something with that land. How do we try to treat those things fairly when we're talking about rankings and we're comparing them to previous years when previously we've not been ranking those things? Is that going to be addressed as part of what you're talking about later?
President Bourne, Commissioner Musich, yes, I have a whole other half of the presentation, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on an idea that we have for incorporating the undeveloped parks into our capital program.
Okay. So I'm probably going to have more questions about that, but I'm glad to know that that'll tie into some of the information we've gotten thus far. If we wanted to look at where parks were ranked when we initially started utilizing this tool, Where on the Park Board website can we find this ranking information for previous years?
President Board and Commissioner Musich, on the budget pages, there are, there's different each year has its own like drop-down menus.
Yep.
So if you were to go to the first year where the neighborhood equity metrics were implemented, which was 2016, and if you pull that down, then those rankings would be there. There would be a spreadsheet like this that would be current for that year.
Okay.
And then last year's spreadsheet is under 2017, and then these will be posted here shortly.
Okay, and the description that would be utilized for those would be the equity matrix rankings, or is there a different description that we should be looking for?
President Board and Commissioner Musich, there's an informational document for both the neighborhood version and the regional version that goes through each of the metrics, why it's an important metric, and then how it is determined, and that's available on those same budget web pages.
All right, lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Musich. Commissioner Kogel.
I wanted to talk about this density metric and just a question about the feasibility of evaluating density based on block group or some other generally used predetermined geographical space that isn't a neighborhood. Neighborhoods are all over the place in terms of how large they are, and I know that it's what we use in a lot of how we think about space, but I'm wondering your thoughts on using one of the kind of census designated spaces for determining density.
President Board and Commissioner Kogel, the neighborhood unit is used typically throughout these metrics because a park sits within that neighborhood unit and generally serves that neighborhood unit. If we went to a smaller unit, then we wouldn't be taking into account sort of the spaces in between, as it were, because a neighborhood would, or a park would be ranked based on a much smaller unit. I would have to verify if the density that we're looking at is the raw population or if it's just divided by area. Presumably it should be divided by area because that would be the density calculation. So let me look at that and verify that before bringing kind of an ordinance question forward, because if we're not taking the neighborhood area into account, I can see your point on that.
Yeah, I mean that's my only thought. I mean it wouldn't have to be smaller. I mean it could be, I suppose could just be a whole census block, which is larger in most cases than the neighborhood. So just a thought. But thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Kogel. Commissioner Forney.
Thank you. I feel like I'm talking in two different presentations, and you brought up the possibility of changing the ordinance. Are you talking about like that we would go back to the city and negotiate a change in the ordinance? Okay, because
no, President Bourne, Commissioner Forney, the equity metric ordinance is ours alone.
Okay. And I just wanted
not
to
the root NPP 20 ordinance. So all I'm suggesting is that in our ordinance, which determines exactly how we apply the equity metrics, that we would modify that density from being a numerical threshold to being a tiered or percentage threshold.
Wonderful. I'm pleased to hear that. And I wholeheartedly agree with that and think it, the more reflective of particularly future, it's appropriate. Thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner Forney. Are there any other questions on this portion of Mr. Arvidsson's presentation? I just have one really quick question and maybe a comment, but the first question, at our last meeting, we had a presentation on the state of wading pools on the north side of Minneapolis, and I'm looking at these change numbers, and like I look, for example, at the Lindale School pool, and there was a huge jump on that, and I'm assuming that was one of the categories around condition, because I know that there's some repairs that are needed there, but I'm not seeing a lot of other, unless I'm just missing them. Can you help me kind of reconcile that update that we had last week with the rankings that we have right now?
President Board, I unfortunately was not at the board meeting last week, so I don't know the content of the presentation that took place exactly. I will say that the Lindale School Pool being ranked very high is because it is within an RCAP actually now, and so that was the reason for its significant jump. Many of the north side parks were already in the very top tier, both for community characteristics and then some of them for the neighborhood, for the asset characteristics as well. So North Commons and Falwell and Cleveland were already in the blue. They've already been brought into the CIP as areas where projects will take place.
Okay, so if an amenity fails when an entire park is already in the CIP and ranked relatively highly, and a significant amenity fails, does that impact the suggested allocation then? So the suggested allocation amount and not necessarily the ranking.
President Bourne, that's trying to think how to answer that. So what we've historically done is if a park is already in the CIP, then we wouldn't adjust that allocation, again, without there being probably some specific request to do that. But often if a facility is failing or has failed, then likely we had accounted for its poor quality and the longevity factor, the fact that it's outside its useful life already. Okay. So that facility may have already been scoring at the highest possible score because of its poorest possible condition. Okay. So when and if it fails, it wouldn't affect that park's score because we've already essentially recognized that something needs to be done. It just unfortunately failed before we got to it.
Thank you. Could you go back to the changes in the RCAP map?
Certainly.
I'm looking at some changes here, and I think if I'm reading this right, like one of the things that you had mentioned that there's a couple of areas that no longer have an RCAP rating, and one of my concerns is. Are folks moving out of the neighborhood because they can no longer afford to live there versus hey, income among these communities is rising, and I have the feeling just from the work a lot of us are doing outside of this room that it's because people can no longer afford to live there. So I do want to make sure, and I know several commissioners have talked about the effects that when we make investments in RCAP neighborhoods, what are we doing holistically with other folks that are helping to try to preserve affordability, so we're not creating the economic driving forces that are moving folks out of some of these neighborhoods that they've called home for a very long time. So I think that at this point is just a comment. I certainly don't have the answer for that, but I think we do want to be really thoughtful of who we're working with when we're making these investments and making sure that we're doing what we can to make sure folks can stay in their homes. That said, are there any other questions on this portion of the section, or with no other questions, I'll ask Mr. Arvinson to move on.
Thank you, President Bourne. So the equity metrics for undeveloped parks. Currently there are 40 parks that can be considered undeveloped. That's a pretty healthy number. By an undeveloped park, we would define that as parks that MPRB owns and has master planned but which have no major built assets. And an example of this would be Solomon Park. It's a very large park. There's really not much there. We have a master plan for that park. Another type would be parks that we own and have master planned, but they're small and may never have major assets. So there are many triangles where we have suggested there might be good areas for seating or natural resource restoration or something like that. That's still a commitment to the community. It's never going to have major assets. It's still an undeveloped park, technically. Or these are parks that the MPRB has envisioned in its master planning efforts, but it doesn't even yet own. And I guess the best example of that would be the park in the North Loop that is called for in the downtown service area master plan. Under the current neighborhood equity metrics, and this is something that Commissioner Musich referred to earlier, it's something that we've struggled with all along the way, is that these parks can never be scored on their park characteristics because they don't have assets. So their equity rankings are always going to remain low, and frankly, they're all going to kind of bunch together. So if they were all brought into the developed parks list, that means that they would both be lower, and also, all of a sudden, we'd be doing nothing but undeveloped parks for years. Okay, so we feel like what probably needs to happen, recognizing that sometimes an undeveloped park may be the most critical park infrastructure in a neighborhood. We have heard that. In places where we have a park and haven't developed it, or in places where we don't have one, that may very well be the only opportunity for that neighborhood to have a park. So how can MPRB invest equitably in undeveloped parks alongside its work on the existing parks? So we convened a work group, a cross-functional work group, to kind of brainstorm this out and to look at our existing metrics and to find out if there's a way to do this. We have an idea that I want to propose to you tonight, which certainly is open for consideration and discussion and slings and arrows. And there's a few details that I also want to have a conversation with you before we potentially bring forward a formal ordinance. A couple of the goals that we were thinking about when we tackled this is that we wanted to work to implement the master plans for undeveloped parks concurrently with those for developed parks. So how do we do some of one and some of the other at the same time? So we're just not waiting for all the undeveloped until the end. How do we focus development in areas with the greatest community need? That is a overarching theme of our equity metrics. But then also, how do we focus development in areas that are otherwise underserved? So undeveloped parks in places where there may be lots of park asset, we might argue that those are less important to get to early than the ones where there isn't anything already. So what we would propose is this basic approach, that we actually keep two separate neighborhood lists, one for developed parks, which is essentially the one you have in front of you, and then one for the undeveloped parks. We do separate them by that category. We dedicate a portion of the neighborhood capital funds each year to the undeveloped parks. This is not unlike what we do with the regional. There are two undeveloped regional parks, which we call opportunity facilities, and we dedicate a portion of the regional dollars to those parks each year. We could do the same for the neighborhood undeveloped parks. We would use new but similar equity criteria to rank those undeveloped parks against each other, not against the developed parks, but within that second list. And then we would gradually move those undeveloped parks onto the developed list once they have assets. So I want to highlight a couple of these points. The first two are maybe straightforward, and the others I want to dig into a little bit. So using new but similar equity criteria to rank undeveloped parks. What would that mean? You guys have seen these kind of blobs before, community characteristics versus park characteristics. We're trying to, in the context of this, have some consistency around our equity metrics. So for the community characteristics, we would use the same four that we use for all the other neighborhood parks, so that there's uniformity. For the park characteristics, we've devised two new metrics that would apply to undeveloped parks only, and that's proximity and asset potential. The proximity metric would be how many of our 5 major assets, building, play area, aquatics, field, and court, those are the 5 we use for all of our other rankings, how many of those are within a 10-minute walk? And there would be a scoring from 0 to 5 points, and a park would get more points if fewer assets were available nearby, thereby recognizing that it may be the only option in that neighborhood. The asset potential would be that whether a park will have major assets according to its master plan. So essentially, are we going to do something major there? Yes or no? And that's either a 0 or a 5. So under this scenario, a park where we are planning major assets, playground, a court, something big, but none of that is nearby, that park would theoretically get the maximum 10 points and would go to the top, toward the top of the list. A park that we're planning a major asset, but there are other parks nearby, it would get, halfway. But maybe a small triangle where we're not planning much and there are other parks nearby, those would still be on the list, but they would be prioritized much lower. So that's the basic idea behind that. Under this characteristic, you see this spreadsheet that we use for some of the other metrics. Essentially, we'd have a total of possible 10 points under the park characteristics, which still keeps the park characteristics at a lower point total than the community characteristics, which again is in the spirit of what we've done all along. So essentially, if all things were equal among those parks under the park characteristics, we would invest where the neighborhood need is greater first. Again, in the spirit of the way our other equity metrics work. So I want to also talk about this idea of moving undeveloped parks onto the developed list once they see improvements. So we would have to develop criteria for becoming developed. In the regional park system, we have very detailed criteria because there's only 2 parks and they're pretty well defined. Here we've got 40 of them and they're all very different. So I would propose that we have a looser definition and that be that those parks become open and accessible to the public, and that some significant portion of the master plan is implemented. At which time, not the entire master plan necessarily, but people can go there and play and have an asset. At that time, they would move onto the developed park list. Okay? I think we would try to make those CIP allocations that we make to those undeveloped parks accomplish these criteria in the first fell swoop, so that after that first allocation, they are considered developed, they move into the developed parks list, where they become eligible for a new allocation to implement the remainder of their master plan. So what will happen is that the CIP, that undeveloped parks list, will gradually shrink and then ultimately disappear. So the basic approach again, separating the parks into 2 lists, dedicating some annual funding to the undeveloped list, ranking those undeveloped parks against each other only, allocating and investing in them, and moving them into the developed list. So as I mentioned, that undeveloped list will gradually go away, which is the idea. We shouldn't have undeveloped parks. We should have implemented master plans. So as I open up the discussion, I got a few things to have you think about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, do the goals and the basic approach seem appropriate? And I can go back to that slide again if you'd like me to. Are there other criteria that should be considered for the undeveloped parks? What other goals are we trying to accomplish there? And then lastly, and this is maybe potentially a tough one, is what proportion of the neighborhood capital funds should be allocated to undeveloped parks each year? And I'm not making a specific recommendation here, but I wanted to give you a couple bullet points that are sort of realities of the CIP. So right now we put about $9 million each year into the neighborhood capital funds. That doesn't include the rehab, it's just the neighborhood capital. It's about $9 million a year. And currently we're putting about 7 to 10 new developed parks into the CIP each year. It depends on their allocations a little bit, but that's an average. For each $1 million that would go into undeveloped parks, there would be about 1 fewer developed park in the CIP. So you can think of that almost as a unit, as you were. So those are some of my prodding questions, and I would now turn it back over to you, President Bourne, for board discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Arvidsson. I see one person right now, Commissioner Musich.
Thank you, President Bourne. Adam, thank you for working so diligently with your colleagues on coming up with a way to start developing some of these undeveloped properties. When I think about other criteria we might want to be looking at, I don't see anything in the criteria you've laid out that identifies really the length of time that communities have been waiting for us to do something with properties that we've acquired for the purpose of turning into parks. As I mentioned earlier, the folks around Ed Solomon have been waiting 14 years already for us to do something, and we've planned out 6 years already in the CIP, so they're really looking at almost 2 decades before we start doing anything on this property. So I would suggest that we might want to look at length of time that those parks have been an asset of the park board but not yet seen any sort of investment. The other question I had was around the categorizing of the assets that we implement and what we're using for the categorization process. Do dog parks fall into like play areas, or what category do they fall under?
President Bowen, Commissioner Musich, there's, in the case of undeveloped parks, there's a little bit of refinement that does need to happen there around the major facility definition. But I think that things like dog parks, skate parks, those would all be encompassed in that play category and would start to be averaged into that play category. So we would be considering those things as one of those major assets for the purposes of proximity and also for the purposes of asset potential.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'm also wondering, you mentioned on here that for every $1 million that we dedicate to developing undeveloped parks, that would drop one developed park off of the list for being invested in that CIP year. Would that be an equivalent investment then in undeveloped parks, where we're only seeing one of them falling off the list a year, or is the expectation that we would be having more than one undeveloped park seeing investment in a year?
President Bowen, Commissioner Musich, I do want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that we drop parks off the CIP. We would add fewer parks to the out year of the CIP. And then in terms of the equivalency, the undeveloped parks are quite varied in how much investment they would even ever have. So there are some undeveloped parks whose master plans have a total of $50,000. So it would sort of depend on which parks are rising to the top, how many of them would be implemented with a theoretical $1 million or any number threshold. We would essentially look at the first park on that list and what it would take to make it a developed park and invest accordingly, and then go to the second park on the list.
Okay, and you said there are approximately 40 undeveloped parks that we would have on that list. Would you expect that in a 20-year period, if we were to invest a minimum of $1 million annually in investing in those spaces, that we would see every single one of those parks have some kind of investment? Or are we thinking that at the end of NPP 20, some of these facilities where people have already been waiting, as I mentioned, many, many, many years, would still not see any investment?
President Bowen, Commissioner Musich, based on the number of these undeveloped parks that have or that will have substantial financial investment versus those where the investment is actually quite small to implement them, I don't believe it'll take 20 years at $1 million a year to get through that entire list. I think we will have moved all of the undeveloped parks into the developed list before the expiration of NPP 20.
Okay, thank you. I believe that answers all of the questions I had at this time. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Commissioner Musich. Commissioner Kogel.
I just have a couple questions, and I apologize if they're basic. How many undeveloped assets do we currently have?
Undeveloped parks?
Yeah, is there like a number that we have?
40.
40, okay. And is there great variation in what you would suspect the necessary investment level to be from park to park? Or is that just determined by whatever our master plan would be?
Yeah, President Bowen, Commissioner Kogel, the sort of master plan build out of a park is determined by the service area master plans. And the cost of building out the undeveloped parks varies significantly. There are some where the cost is relatively high, though that number is much fewer than those parks where the cost is very low, where we are talking about some landscaping, natural restoration, benches, public art, walkways. The vast majority of the undeveloped parks fall into that category, into that lower investment category.
Okay. Okay, so I suppose then one consideration would be taking that into consideration. I mean, I would think that it would be beneficial for us to consider what the bang for our buck is, how quickly and how many parks we'd be able to be investing in over time compared to investing in one that was high on the list for another reason, but took a substantial amount of funding. Yeah.
Can President Bourne, can I ask a clarifying question? Commissioner Cogill, what we've suggested here is one of the metrics, the sort of asset potential metric, would actually, I think, do the opposite of what you just suggested. So I want to clarify your thought and your opinion on that. What we had suggested was to prioritize those parks where we actually would be building a major asset that might serve the community with something more than a bench and a walkway. And so under this system, we would be essentially rewarding those parks whose area and whose master plans are calling for there to be something more substantial, and actually wait on some of the smaller improvements until later. So I wanted to clarify whether you are...
So that sounds like the opposite of what I just suggested.
It does. So,
yes.
Right, and if you're suggesting the opposite, that's fair. I just want to make sure that
I believe that that's true at this point, but I'd be interested in learning more about the thought process behind that. I mean, if I'm thinking about quick expansion of number of people living in neighborhoods and the finite resources that we have and the number of properties that we have, it seems like it might be beneficial to consider how many spaces we are making habitable for public use over how many spaces we're making super cool and inviting with a lot of additional amenities.
President Bourne, Commissioner Cogill, the reasoning behind it was that those parks that have master plans that are calling for these additional assets are more likely to be in a place where those assets don't exist. Mm-hmm. So we have master planned them in because of the dearth in that area. So we felt that those parks where major assets can be implemented would provide more immediate service than perhaps a triangle with a bench and a walkway, which doesn't increase recreational value perhaps as much as a play area might. Again, that's just the background to it, but I can certainly note that you definitely would, if you started the other way around, you would definitely do a lot more parks a lot faster.
Right.
I mean, you do 10, 15 of them a year.
Right.
And then move on to the big ones later.
Okay, I see. I don't know if I have any further questions. It's just a thought, I guess, that I have.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Cogill, Commissioner Vita, followed by Forney.
Thank you, President Bourne. I think Commissioner Cogill just confused me. No. So with these assets, the 5 major assets and these undeveloped parks, has the community been involved in like what's major to them, or like are there any future plans in having some community input if it hasn't already been any?
President Bourne, Commissioner Vita, the service area master plans that are ongoing, that have significant community engagement around them, that's the process by which the community has determined the designs and master plans of all the parks, including the undeveloped ones. So we have master planned Solomon Park, we have master planned North Loop Park. In the North Service Area master plan, which just recently had a CAC recommendation but has not yet become before you, there are some undeveloped park areas that have been identified and master planned. So the community is speaking to us robustly through those planning processes, and it's those master plans which are the guidance for some of these metrics. We want to implement the master plan and find an equitable system for doing that.
And can that be like ongoing? Because I mean, it's going to take a while for some spaces to be developed. So will there be opportunities for people to chime in? Because things may change, right? Like what may be needed now may be different in 5 years. So is that going to be an ongoing thing, or are we going to use what we have now 10 years from now to still develop in that area?
President Bourne, Commissioner Vita, whenever a capital improvement project begins, we re-engage with the community to talk about the design of that and what portions of that master plan want to be implemented now, or if there are necessary changes. And the master plans have written into the master plan is a method for amending them if we find during that subsequent community engagement that there's a very different community need. I don't think we want to take making those changes too lightly, because there was a lot of engagement that went into the master plans themselves, but there are mechanisms to continue that conversation as we implement projects.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Vita. Commissioner Forney.
Thank you. Is there a map of just undeveloped parks?
President Boyd and Commissioner Forney, I don't have one offhand, but I can create that, and it's probably a worthwhile thing to bring forward. If we bring ordinance language forward, I was intending to do one thing and I'll do a second thing. And the first thing I was intending was to actually show the rankings based on the criteria that we bring forward. So a sheet similar to this, but for the undeveloped parks, we need to show you that list, how they'd be ranked. And the second thing we'll do is we'll do a key map, because yes, these are lesser known assets.
But yeah, I think that everybody's having a hard time visualizing, okay, where are these undeveloped parks? How come we haven't done something with them?
All
But,
over
you
the
know,
place.
anyway, I know they're everywhere, but that would be very helpful. And I am optimistic that we will be receiving future lands. And I would hope that we could somehow, how does that phase into this? You know, whatever anticipated or unanticipated things, that somehow we can schedule those things, because, you know, I'm sure the airport's going to go away and we're going to have that as far as all that undeveloped land. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh yeah, President Boyd and Commissioner Forney, parcels that we do not own but have identified in service area master plans would get a slot, would get a line on the undeveloped parks list. So the North Loop Park does not exist. It is called for in a master plan. It is considered a park. It would get a score all the way across, and it would be eligible for improvement. Similar to, we are likely to propose to you, the CAC for the north side has recommended that we need some additional parkland in the northwestern part of the service area, west of the cemetery. If adopted, as board policy in the North Service Area Master Plan, that park search area would become an undeveloped park space. Right now in the South Service Area, we're calling for additional parkland to be explored at Hiawatha, Midtown Greenway, Lake Street kind of zone. So we don't have a name for that park, but we would call it the Hiawatha Midtown Search Area, and we'd put it on this list and it would get scored. And that'd be the way to kind of even focus on those parks that we don't, in fact, possess yet.
Wonderful, good. And then I guess we keep on talking about major assets. I mean, a tennis court or, you know, whatever. Of one of the assets, could we possibly have just natural areas? I mean, coming before us is going to be a forest school, you know, and if that's a need or a desire expressed by the community, whatever, any place that we can at least have that as a potential development, I suppose. Thank you. And marvelous. I appreciate this.
Thank you, Commissioner Forney. Commissioner Musich for the second time.
Thank you, President Bourne. So Commissioner Forney has got me thinking. For properties that we own, like the land under the airport and properties along the riverfront that we have buildings on currently that we intend to make parks someday, would those properties at the time that they become available for park development end up on this undeveloped park list? And are we doing analysis on an annual basis to determine if we have any of those properties that we should be adding?
President Bourne and Commissioner Musich, certainly it would be possible for parks to come on to the undeveloped park list over time as things change if we get an opportunity. So yes, it's not going to be a static list. I will say the properties on the upper river are part of the implementation of Above the Falls Regional Park. So that's in the regional bucket, and that wouldn't be a neighborhood park. It's going to get money under the regional equity metric regularly over time until it is completed. So the Above the Falls is essentially the regional equivalent of what we're talking about here with the neighborhood ones.
Okay.
So all of those little parcels sort of add up to become the undeveloped Above the Falls. But if in the theoretical situation that the airport goes away and we end up with a whole lot of land there all of a sudden, then I think you would add that to the undeveloped parks list and you would score it under the metric and you would invest in it when its number came up.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Musich. I have a couple of just things to think about as we're moving forward here, and a couple of specific questions. When we were developing NPP 20, and we were going out and telling people that this is to fix our neighborhood parks that we have, were our undeveloped parcels part of that conversation and part of that, and part of those numbers we were putting forward to folks?
At that time, the undeveloped parcels, the triangles and all that, they weren't included in the dollar amounts because they didn't have major assets. But one of the things that I can recall hearing from the community during that process was that there were areas of town that we still weren't serving with any kind of park. And so this is one way of trying to address that concern also.
Okay. No, I understand that. One of the, I mean, some of the other things that that conversations that the community was having during Close the Gap and MPP 20 was also the need for programming, and we've really kind of secured these NPP 20 funds and made a promise that they would be spent on what we said they would be used for. So I do have concern about just a reallocation of NPP 20 funds. I mean, I would be very open to setting up an undeveloped park fund, but I think that has to be associated with new funding, because if I'm hearing you right, we've already presented to the city that, at the end of MPP 20, we will have gone through that. We will have gone through that list and back to the top. Costs are going to go up over the years, and that will also adjust for the income under MPP 20 will also adjust too. But I'm nervous that we will be slowing down that work if we're taking MPP 20 funds to fix things to develop things that were not part of what the repair list was. And we might not get through that list. So I think we would really need to look at some sort of capital levy for undeveloped parks. Otherwise, I feel like there are a lot of folks that would feel like we were breaking this promise of NPP 20. I also just wanted to point out too, just for folks that are kind of listening to the language that we're using, it is okay for the park board to have undeveloped spaces and natural spaces. And so what we're very specifically talking about are things that we have long-term plans about to be neighborhood parks, so similar to a playground like a Bryan Square, or so we're not talking about taking our natural spaces and developing them. I just want to make sure that people are hearing that. So I do have some concerns about where that funding will come from. I think we should only move forward with a dedicated source of funds for this. And I think we would find support for that. I did have one specific question. We've used Solomon as an example a few times. I'm not entirely sure of the floodplain map in that portion of town, but I understand a lot of that area captures a lot of rainwater, and we're having a lot of conversations about storm and groundwater. I'm looking at our own website, and it looks like Solomon Park maintains, on our own website, maintains some natural wetlands. So I would be a little bit concerned, as we're trying to address water issues in that part of town, that we're looking at developing a currently undeveloped area that is close to more than a quarter of the size of Hiawatha Golf Course, which we're trying to address right now. So I would just be a little bit concerned about how much development we're looking at doing there while we're trying to restore some natural areas walking distance away just on the other side of the lake. So have we thought a little bit about that?
Yep, President Bourne, again, during the master planning processes for all these parks, we're looking at, the inherent character of both existing and undeveloped parks. And, development is probably a word that gets equated with skyscrapers. But when we talk about developing a park, that can happen in a lot of different ways. And the master plan for Ed Solomon Park is really limited to some small picnic areas on the higher ground, trails, boardwalks, a disc golf course, so things like that. The design for the park does take into account the fact that is a more naturalized park with wetlands within it. There are restrictions actually from the airport on that park, which were considered as part of the master plan. So I think we're trying not to overburden a park And we do that through the master planning process with that community engagement in place.
Okay.
So we wouldn't go and implement beyond that master plan for Ed Solomon just because it came on this list.
Okay. Then just kind of my other point, so I would like to do this if we can find a dedicated source of funds for it. One of my kind of concurrent concerns with that is on the earlier part of your presentation, we talked about our park dedication fee schedule, and that's all to be determined. So we have another source of dedicated funds to address a different issue within the park board right now that I think that there's a lot of anxiety around folks that are paying those fees, and a lot of anxiety with some of the folks on the board that we're sitting on, I think, like $10 or $11 million of unplanned park dedication fee funds too. So I just want to make sure we don't get too far ahead of our skis on plans and we're starting to implement. So those are just some things I want you to walk away with. Commissioner Musich, for a third time.
Thank you, President Bourne. I guess I'm going to have to fundamentally disagree with your thought that we need to find dedicated funding for undeveloped parks in the system. When we talked with the public and with our fellow elected officials about MPP 20, we specifically talked about the need to really address people's access to park spaces and ensuring that we are implementing master plans in a timely manner and maintaining the assets that we have to a reasonable degree. When I talked with folks that represent the area that I represent, we did talk about Solomon a lot because there is a ton of frustration from the community that we're not doing anything to invest in a space that we've owned for a very long time that people want to utilize as a neighborhood park. They really would like trails. They would like the ability to have better access to the wetland areas for bird viewing and just immersing themselves in that nature space. We also have folks that really would like to see that we do something to activate the space more because right now it doesn't have a ton of use that is positive. And so if we continue to just try to ignore the space and not invest in it, which is I think what will happen if we start talking about not utilizing MPP 20 money to invest in all of our neighborhood park spaces, there's going to be a lot more frustration coming from people. And when I talk about undesirable use of the space, there's a lot of people that are using it as an off-leash dog park right now. And so people are afraid to be in it for fear that they might be attacked by dogs. We've got a lot of young people that are off in the woods, just kind of up to whatever. And I think if we had more people in the parks, people might want to behave in a way that's more respectful of other users. So, I would hope that we can all agree that investing in parks for everyone and not just people that already have invested assets is not something that we can't get behind.
Thank you, Commissioner Musich. Just a clarifying question because I'm hearing two different sets of facts here about what conversations and what information was brought forward in the MPP 20 discussion. So I just want to make sure that we are true to the folks and the commitments that we made. So what I'm hearing you say is when we went to the community and we took pictures of all of our broken assets and we mapped out the lifespan and we asked for a set amount of money from the city to be codified in ordinance, that included no investments or no estimates for undeveloped land or undeveloped parks.
President Bourne, so a question of the underlying data had to do with looking at major assets in our parks. Major assets did not include benches, drinking fountains in any parks. But we use those major assets as a guide to suggest funding levels for the park system. So it's hard for me to respond either way to say that the undeveloped facilities were in or out. I don't think it was expressly one way or the other.
Okay, I just don't want to be slower about adding a broken wading pool into our CIP to develop something that will then expand our network of things that we have to take care of, and then we'll slow down the ability to fix more broken things towards the end of that time. I think, Deputy Superintendent, did you have do you have an answer to that question, or can I go back to the order?
I have a suggestion for that question. I know when we talked to the community at the time, we had a lot of dialogue around the difference between funding new items versus taking care of what we have. And there was a kind of a ratio in terms of how people felt we should be looking at future items versus taking care of what we have. So I think what might be helpful to this conversation is we go back, we look at the materials that we used, we'd be able to come back to you and better articulate, because we're all kind of going off of some of the memory that we have of the time, but be able to better articulate an answer to that question.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Superintendent. I think Superintendent Merrill, and then, okay.
To this question, the undeveloped parks are on the neighborhood park list. They're just at the bottom of the list. And what Adam was trying to do was to say, here is a way, these developed parks will probably never happen, or if they happen, they will be 20 years down the road. So here's a way to think about those undeveloped parks in terms of how they potentially could be funded. And so he was taking the bottom of his list, of the park list, and saying, here's a way that we can get to some of these parks that we might not get to. And so that's really what this is all about. This really isn't creating a whole new set of parks to be funded, but it's really saying, we've got a list of all of our park properties. At the bottom of the list, here's some parks that will never rise to the top because they don't have park assets. And he was trying to come up with a way to have us take a look at some of those parks and how we could get those undeveloped parks done. So,
thank you, Superintendent. Commissioner Severson.
I guess my biggest concern, I appreciate that Superintendent Merrill is to discuss Follow Park again, where we have 3 major issues in North Minneapolis. High rate of people of color. I mean, it's interesting that it dropped 4 places here too, but my concern is if we have something like this happen, what if Follow Park's 10th on the list and we take care of the first 9 and then we develop a Solomon Park instead of maintaining or improving Follow Park? That's a legitimate concern for that community. I hate to stress it again, we have a broken wading pool that sounds unrepairable. We have tennis courts that have been broke for over 10 years now and unsafe to walk on, and now we also have a flooding problem that we've been dealing with for 3 years. That's just one of the parks. So that's just my concern, but I really do appreciate you trying to figure out a way to make this happen. But an alternative funding source, I'd be all for something like that.
Mr. Robertson, when we talked about when we started talking about Emerald Ash Borer, I'm almost seeing kind of a parallel between this and the forestation levy. We had a very specific, what I'm hearing you say, that undeveloped parks will only be undeveloped until we develop them. So if we allocate funding towards them, eventually that list will go away. So I think it would be interesting in part of this conversation to come up with how much money you would need to make that go away in a reasonable amount of time, and then that helps us approach the city and the Board of Estimate and Taxation. Maybe we can do a time-specific levy that doesn't take away from MPP $20 and needed funds, and funds that I feel like a lot of us made commitments that we would spend on repairs, but would also demonstrate this other need that I think all of us do want to invest in, and give folks an opportunity to kind of have a pathway forward together with it. So if you could come up with kind of a financial projection, what we would need for maybe it's a separate levy, just like the forestry levy, and it lasts 10 years or 15 years or 8 years. If you want to come together with a plan like that, I think the entire board would support additional funding for undeveloped lands for undeveloped parks if it wasn't pulling from some of our current projects. So. Thank you, Mr. Arvidsson. Do folks have any other questions before we move on to your second presentation of the evening? I think we'll go ahead and move forward.
in the second presentation is it's an action, and I actually don't have a formal presentation because it's a letter. I will stand for questions if the board.
You are right, and I put my agenda down. So under new business, for the purposes of discussion, we would need somebody to move this forward, regardless of what we're doing. So I would entertain a motion right now for 2018-241, approving a comment letter on the City of Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Again, noting that it's just for discussion purposes. Is there a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved. Is there a
Second.
second? It's been moved and it's been moved and seconded. Mr. Arvidsson prepared a draft letter based on some of our comments and staff work. Do folks have questions for Mr. Arvidsson? Do folks have discussion on the resolution or the letter in general? Commissioner Meyer, followed by Kogel.
Can you show the map that you showed us at the previous meeting with the 2040 draft plan for Southwest that shows the West Lake and Bedemikoska?
Yes. Commissioner Meyer, it may take a moment.
Yeah, while you're pulling that up, I have 3 areas that I wanted to talk about related to the draft letter. First, we had a lot of people comment about the proposed changes to the shoreland overlay. And I wanted you to talk more about why it is that staff proposed that, and note that it was a staff proposal and not something directed by any commissioner. Can you talk about more about the background of that?
I can, thank you. President Bourne, Commissioner Meyer, and my thanks also to the folks that came out to talk about this topic. Sometimes a comment letter on a comprehensive plan, it's pretty dry stuff, so I appreciate them all taking the time. Certainly the intent here was not to suggest an elimination or a weakening of the shoreland overlay district, but rather to actually make it more powerful in terms of dealing with some of the environmental issues that it perhaps doesn't address as well today, most notably water quality. So the intent here was that, there's I recognize, as some of the speakers brought forward, there's a regular stream of variances that come forward for, in most cases, kind of small height variances, not the tower ones, but going from 28 feet to 35 feet or something of that like, which really don't have much impact on water quality or environmental resources. So our reasoning behind bringing this forward to you for consideration in the letter was to suggest that it might be time to build on what had been done with the Shoreland Overlay District in the past and actually make it perhaps even more powerful around environmental factors. And one way of doing that we had suggested was to move toward more of a performance zoning approach than a traditional zoning approach. And I actually do have a brief couple of slides that I can bring out at some point if you want me to, but I don't know if that answers your first question.
How often are you getting variances on this?
2 to 3 per month are the ones that I'm notified of as the staff person that sort of gets communicated by the city in their standard notification process.
Right, and we're just getting notified. We don't actually have any say on these, right?
We're able to submit a letter, which then typically it's our planning commission representative then brings forward to the planning commission. But it's essentially what we get is a notification that something is coming before the planning commission, and here's the project. How do you feel about it? It's the notification we get is no different than the notification that the next door neighbor would get. The city notifies everyone within a 300-foot radius of a project if there's a variance being sought, and we are often within 300 feet, so we get a notification. I would not consider that to be involvement in the implementation or application of this ordinance, and I think one of the things that I had hoped for to request of the city, should this language go forward, was that we actually would have a more deliberate involvement earlier in the process beyond just that back-end notification.
Okay, thank you. So, and we had lots of comments, and I got lots of emails asking me not to eliminate the shoreland overlay, but as far as I can see, we're not eliminating anything. We're strengthening it. A couple things to note about that, these variances are happening all the time. They're always getting approved. So the ordinance hasn't, really been enacted. And then the second thing is that the original objective of the ordinance is to reduce water pollution, phosphates, nitrates, things like that. And the ordinance in its current form isn't doing anything to contribute to that. So this performance-based standard would actually do things toward improving the water quality. And we don't want to ask for, a mandate specifically for green roofs on every building or rain barrels or micromanage exactly how they accomplish this improved water quality. But we want to say you have to do something if you're going to build in proximity to our bodies of water. You have to improve the pollution level somehow. So I think this is a pretty good idea. I do think that there's probably some significant misunderstanding about it, but I asked you to show up the map. Can you scroll down a little bit on that? Because I just want to show the, if you can show all the lake areas.
You want me to show, how much do you want me to show?
That's good, I think, there. The reason I asked is because, the areas, and this is actually not the one is it?
You want to do the build form one?
Yeah.
Is this a good view?
Yeah, this is good. So the areas on the north side of Budemakaska are zoned for tall buildings, and I think that's appropriate as noted in the draft because it's close to light rail. In this draft, that's what they're zoned for, right? Yep. All the other areas are zoned for 2.5 stories, right? So I was asking people who were calling me, what areas are you concerned about? And if it's just the north side, then if the area is near light rail, then I think that those are appropriate places for development. The rest of them are 2.5 stories, so I don't think that there's much of an impact there. Yeah, that's on the north side of the lake. So if there are areas that people believe should be in green, that should be parkland, instead of having anything developed on them at all, then I'm willing to work with people on that. Now, I know a lot of people had comments. We can talk more later about this. I think it would probably be a good idea for us to pass some general staff directives tonight and then consider a revised letter at our next meeting. But in general, I think that this is a good idea to make some changes to improve our water quality and actually enforce those and bring the park board involved in it, because we're not involved right now, we're just being notified. I think it would be a good thing if we actually had a significant say in it. The second thing I wanted to comment on was there are 2 points in the letter where it says that we're not going to comment on density, but then the letter contradicts itself by talking about density multiple times, or talking about things that would affect density. For example, at the beginning it says the plan's specific language on racial equity, economic opportunity, and housing availability. That's the relevant one. That we support those things. And increasing housing availability increases the density of the city. If there are more people living in the city, then that means there's denser cities. It also says MPRB is not opposed to increased heights and densities where appropriate, such as Westlake, which is already very dense and will soon be in close proximity to light rail transit. It says in the housing access section, referring to policies 1, 37, and 41, that MPRB supports policies that protect housing options and introduce new housing opportunities for people of various backgrounds and income levels. These policies are central to diversifying and providing equitable park access. And then we also talk about homelessness with a whole paragraph about that, saying that MPRB strongly supports the elimination of homelessness and increasing access to safe, affordable housing. And that in particular, the homelessness issue, makes that a really relevant issue to the park board. When I did a bike along with the police a month ago, the whole day we were mostly dealing with homelessness in one way or another. And Chief Fajardo told us at a previous meeting that homelessness is worse now than it ever has been before while he's been working here. And we should ask ourselves why it is that homelessness is worse now than it was previously, and my answer would be that the vacancy rate for the city is lower now than it has been before. At about 2% vacancy level, it's the lowest of any metro in the country. So I think that it would be appropriate for us to leave those comments as is that do refer to homelessness and housing policy, and simply remove the statements that say we're not going to comment on density, because those are comments on density. And then the third addition that I would like to make is one that I referred to at the previous meeting when we had discussion about it. Under the tree canopy section, I really feel that whenever a road gets reconstructed, we should be pushing utility lines to be buried, because just a few months ago, in my district, Excel was going around cutting down or severely trimming trees all over. I got a lot of complaints about that. And one of the biggest ways that we can improve the tree canopy is to bury those lines, and trees can replace them. So I don't know if you would like me to make motions about each of those staff directives or have discussion about it first, but I'll wait for your...
Commissioner Meyer, why don't we wait to see where the discussion goes, and why don't we wait to see where the discussion goes?
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Meyer. Commissioner Kogel.
Thank you, President Bourne, and thanks to everybody who came out to talk about the importance of the Shoreline Overlay District, and also to stress the importance of the environmental protections that are so critical to our lakes. I am supportive of staff going back and rethinking some of the wording around the comments around shoreland overlay, and really acknowledging the really critical role, even if just in the values that it affirms the Shoreland Overlay District has had in our city for many years, and also highlight that we want to build upon that, so that, as Commissioner Meyer mentioned, shoreland overlay and the values around environmental water quality and environmental stewardship and access to water quality and access to our lakes is actually affirmed and has teeth, and is implemented. As the representative on the Planning Commission, I can say that it's not something that is consistently looked at, even for projects outside of the overlay area of 1,000 feet. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the park board, by having some strong language in this letter, to be at the table earlier with a lot of different development proposals wherever they are, to have an impact on thinking about impervious surface, stormwater treatment facilities, green roofs. There are a lot of things that can't be required right now by developers, but if environmental stewardship agencies like the MPRB are at the table earlier, we're going to have an impact there more clearly. So I support a little bit of change in terms of how we're wording this, but especially in terms of being at the table early, that final bullet point, as a recommendation, I think that's critical, and I'm really happy that is a consideration.
Thank you, Commissioner Kogel. Commissioner Forney.
Thank you. Adam, you were seeking for us to ask the question. We refer to this as performance-based, and I think that I am, in a lot of ways, very ignorant of what that means. I have a small amount of knowledge on it, and I was wondering if you could share with us, number one, what it means, and maybe give some examples of how this could strengthen the shoreland overlay.
Sure. I'll keep this very brief because you've seen a lot of PowerPoint from me already tonight. So I want to stress that the state does require municipalities to protect shoreland. It is, I think there was a speaker tonight that mentioned that. There's no way that the shoreland overlay district could simply be eliminated. Something would have to be in place. There's a line here from the DNR that stresses that. The stated purpose of Minneapolis' shoreland district, as stated in the ordinance, is to preserve and enhance the environmental qualities of surface waters, preserve and enhance the natural and economic values of shoreland areas, provide for the efficient and beneficial use of those waters, and protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And that last one is kind of a standard code language thing. Minneapolis' shoreline district regulates specifically, and these are the items in that ordinance, it regulates the height of structures, it regulates development on steep slopes, grading and filling, removal of vegetation, and stormwater management. Though I will say the stormwater management language is fairly general and mostly defers to making sure that all the other requirements for stormwater management are met. In terms of zoning, if on those points, some of the things that are in the ordinance right now are very prescriptive, and some are almost too general to even be enforceable. So traditional zoning, what it would do, or what it does, is it specifically regulates certain aspects of development. For instance, the height, which has been brought up a lot tonight. There are height limits within the shoreland overlay district. So that's traditional zoning, which regulates a height. Under traditional zoning, those requirements have to be met, period, or a variance has to be requested and granted. It's our way, or you ask permission to do something different. And what happens then is municipalities really only have leverage when variances are requested. If somebody's doing something within all the code guidelines, they can essentially do so, and the city cannot prevent them from doing so because they are in line with code. Under performance zoning, a district would set targets for desired outcomes. So if there's a water quality outcome, that target, a target could be set. And those targets can be hardlined. They don't have to be just improve. It can be a 35% reduction in total phosphorus from previous condition. I'm just throwing out numbers. So those targets are set. The outcomes that are set can be met in a variety of different ways, from site to site, development to development. So there's flexibility in implementation, but the targets must be met. What this does is it allows flexibility in design, but it also allows, and this is what's really important for us, I think, as a park board, is it allows municipalities to participate in the decision-making process no matter what. So regardless of whether someone's asking for a variance or not, under performance zoning, there would be some participation by the city and hopefully by the park board in how those developers are meeting those goals. And one example that I will raise is that there are often homes around the lakes, very large homes, where pairs of single-family lots are removed and a much larger home is built that meets the height requirement, meets the grading requirement, and significantly increases impervious surface. Under that scenario, we don't have any jurisdiction. We don't have anything to say about it because they're meeting the code requirements. Under performance zoning, they would have to still meet certain performance criteria to improve water quality, to deal with aesthetics, to tackle whatever you kind of want them to do. And the arbiters of that would be the agencies, again, regardless of whether they're asking for a variance or not.
End of tutorial?
End of tutorial, yes, sorry.
Thank you, Adam. That really is helpful, not only for myself, but hopefully, for the audience here and whoever's watching. I have to say that in some ways I might have been the person who opened Pandora's box. Density is one of the largest things that's being talked about in the comp plan, in the city's comprehensive 2040, whatever they call it. And what I wanted to do is, having served on the Planning Commission, is I wanted to put, as we're calling it, the teeth back into this ordinance because it's going to be even more threatened. And so that it was the purpose of it, is how can we approach this in a way that it is stronger and works better for our bodies of water and protecting them. that is why I brought it up. And like I say, possibly other people have talked about it, but I feel like I was one who really looked into it. I've read every page of the comp plan, and as I shared with Adam, I feel that every single page refers to parks and includes parks, because as you all know, Minneapolis just happens to be a city inside of a park. So I was approaching it with that lens. Whether or not we comment on density or not, I don't know that that's really what's appropriate or not. It's more how, from our lens, from our perspective, how we can govern good density, I guess is the best way to say it, and everything. So that's, what I was trying to establish. Some of the things that I found that were really missing within the comp plan is wherever development is, how can we make connections? As Commissioner Meyer referred to, anytime a tree is taken out, can we bury power lines? Well, to me, anytime we can make stronger connections, green connections, that are also grade separated from our pedestrian or automobiles, I think are equally as important. So it's with that lens that, if we're going to have a city that grows, how do we grow and keep it that park that city happens to be inside of? So the shoreline overlay is our vehicle. It is. But how can we make it so that it adapts appropriately for density, if that's the word? And I'm sorry, I don't know why we call it density. To me, it's about being compact. That might have been a better word to be selling this plan. The last thing that to me was very, very important, and that is that if we are talking about affordable housing, or at least the city's talking about it, number one, most of you know there wasn't any teeth in there, absolutely none, and that was very bothersome to me. And we have the park dedication fee, and the park dedication fee presently waives for affordable housing. So anywhere we have development, new development, any housing development and everything, parkland dedication fees are going to be going into areas that are market rate. So in other words, we're just going to be adding more richness to the already rich assets that the city has. And yet where we're putting affordable housing, which there's no distinction of where that's going to be, more than likely it's not going to be where there's market rate, the way the plan is written right now. So therefore, we're not being able to be equitable with our parkland dedication fee. That is very bothersome to me. It's perpetuating what already this city has been very, very consistent in doing, in adding, where we have wealthy areas, that we are going to put more and more green space, give more access, and denying the areas that are underserved. So I really have a hard time with it, and I want the city to approach that. In my personal opinion, I feel that they should require that a percentage of every single solitary development should have affordable housing. And therefore, we would be distributing, our parkland dedication fee equity throughout the city. So those were my three biggest concerns. Like I say, I found those all the way through the entire plan. I just very much appreciate, what Adam has distilled. This has been a conversation. It was presented to the board before, so I hope that we have been transparent on it. But we really, really do want to hear from you, but I want to really clarify that we are not getting rid of the shoreline overlay, but we want to add teeth to it. And to me, the performance space seems to be a better way to continue this legacy that, thank you, elect, for starting, 40 years ago. I really appreciate it. We want to continue that whole advocacy and making sure that we are safeguarding our natural amenities, for generations to come. And that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Commissioner Forney, Commissioner Musich.
Thank you, President Bourne. So I really appreciated the way that we talked about trying to further protect the Shoreland Overlay District. But I was a little disappointed that